Okay, I believe Francois is coming down, so I would like to start session 3. Session 3 consists of two subsessions. The first session is about China's power assessed from a global and regional perspective. And we have three presenters, Professor Sean Breslin from the University of Warwick, Professor David Kang from the University of Southern California, and Professor Evelyn Goh from Australian National University. Professor Sean Breslin will talk about China's power assessed from a global perspective. And the two remaining speakers will talk about China's power assessed from regional perspectives. And then we have two discussants. He has not yet come down, but Francois Gaudemont, European Council on Foreign Relations, and Professor Scott Kennedy of Indiana University. Each speaker will speak for 15 minutes, and each discussant will also use 15 minutes for the discussion of two papers each. Okay? So, Sean.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's very good to be here. I've already learned a huge amount so far, and it's a very useful process to give the paper and get some feedback for the revisions. I should give a little bit of context. I'm particularly interested in looking back 30 years, because it is 30 years this year since I first went to China as an undergraduate. You are allowed at this stage to say, surely you're not old enough, but I'll take that as a given. Thank you. If anybody had suggested then that we'd be talking about China as a global power, they probably would have been locked away. The second context is the paper is about China from a Chinese power from a global perspective, but I should point out that perhaps it's more correct to say from a European perspective, for a couple of reasons. I don't think the idea of China as a security threat is really much on the agenda in Europe. We don't see it that way at all. There are people who are interested in Chinese security, but as an academic issue, not as a sort of direct and real threat for Europe. And secondly, I think there is a very strong emphasis on China's power, global power already here. I think there are some unrealistic expectations about what China is and what it offers. And I think that's one of the reasons why some European countries got in a little bit of a mess over China's role at Copenhagen, for example. I think there were some mistaken expectations about what Chinese behaviour and Chinese ability and desire to take global leadership actually is. And China is very much seen as an opportunity and in many respects a competitive opportunity. And that has driven, I think, much of individual European countries' relationships towards China over recent years. Now, I was half tempted to do a Jerry Siegel and say, you know, China's power, ha, no. But of course that's a bit ridiculous to try and keep that line going at the moment. And actually I don't think Jerry Siegel really believed it when he said it. I think what Jerry was really saying was, is Chinese power quite as big as some people are trying to make it out to be? But that wasn't quite as snappy as saying, does China matter? I do have some scepticism. I've already said that this morning, that I'm a little bit wary about the relationship between states and major companies when we're talking about power. I think in globalized production, it makes it quite difficult to simply ascribe power to a single country rather than looking at the wider production networks. I think the demise of American power is often exaggerated. I think sometimes when we see a new actor doing new things, we tend to assign more power to it than old actors. For example, if you look at Chinese investment compared to European Union and Japan and America, you know, other countries still are important. They are still doing important things. And also, I'm not wholly sure that the current trajectory of Chinese growth can be taken for granted. And a lot of people do. A lot of people are working from straight line assumptions. But having said that, clearly is the case that China's global power has increased. But then I hit this real snag of how do we define what global power actually means? I mean, what does it take to be a global power? What does it mean to have global power? We heard some definitions this morning in terms of global governance, and they're important. But if we just move away to bigger pictures of what it means to be a global power, I began to hit a little bit of a problem. And it's one of the reasons what's made writing this paper much harder than I thought, but much more interesting than I thought. And so I've used 5 main definitions. One comes from the idea that a country's interests has a global influence. I remember an article in an English paper called the Daily Mail a few years ago complaining that because of the rise of the Chinese middle class, garden equipment had got more expensive in the UK. And that's some sort of form of power. And James King wrote about the importance of the daily importance of China. China takes on a daily importance in the global lives of individuals across the world. Not necessarily by intention. It might be a more passive and non-intentional global spread of your interests and influences. The second, and this is where I'm going to look at Chen Zemin, because I once wrote a paper and I sent it to him and talked about China's imagined power, and his reply was, that's a totally facile argument. But I'm going to try and repeat it here now, and we'll see how far we get. I think the idea of China as a global power actually is important in itself. It's one way of defining it as a global power. People say that it is. But I do actually think that thinking of China as a global power in some ways empowers it. And I think power is something that is partly internally derived, but also partly externally given. And I'll try and give an example of that later on. But I do think that the idea of China as a global power has actually led some countries to do things which they otherwise would not wanted to have done. I'll try and explain that later. Third definition is other countries taking your interests into account when making any decisions, and I think we can clearly see that specifically in terms of any attempt to reform global governance after 2008 and the global crisis. Generating change that other countries wouldn't want to take is, I suppose, the classic definition. But I think when most people are thinking about China as a global power, actually something that you wrote springs to mind. You said something like, if you say that China has played a responsible role so far, people will say, oh, so far. You know, wait until it's got the power to change the world, and then it will. Yeah. And I think that's really interesting. That is, I think, what a lot of people are talking about when they're talking about China as a global power. A country that will try and change the world and try and shape the world to one of its interests. Susan Strange talked about the structural power to shape the globe. And she didn't just mean institutions, but she meant rules and norms as well, which then brings us onto the different dimensions. So if we take these different definitions, within each of these, what are the dimensions? And one of them is normative power. People have been referring to it as soft power perhaps today. I prefer normative power. And I come back actually in a positive way now to what Chen Zemin said. I think in many respects China is a normative power, a power that has immunity. I think China's global normative power grants it immunity, increasingly the ability to defend itself from criticisms from, if you like, the global liberal order. And so it's a defensive, if you like, power. And it's a form of definitional power, whereby, for example, I've got an article coming out in a couple of months on Chinese conceptions of human security. And yes, there are Chinese conceptions of human security. And my argument is that rather than dismiss it as a Western a liberal norm, that there is an attempt to say, this is what we mean by it. So now we will be judged by what we mean by it. So it's an anti-universalist position. In fact, you might say that China's normative position is an anti-normative position. By saying that there are no universal normative norms, that in fact becomes a norm in itself. And in many ways, I think that's become quite attractive when combined with the idea of China as an alternative to the Western way of doing things, which has, let's face it, not had the best of times since the Iraq War and indeed the global crisis. So I do think this ideational power is important. I do think the way that people think about China is important. I do think the way that China projects itself as an alternative is important. But I would have to say that I think that the key to China's growing strength in global politics is its material power. And here I decided to try and break it down into markets, production, and finance. And if we think of China's market power, it's here perhaps that we first saw the early signs of China being described as having global power, as the rise of Chinese exports, particularly in the early to mid-1990s, became very important. This is where I come back to this idea of thinking about China and futurology, because I think futurology has been actually quite important in the way that others have sort of empowered China from without. Because if you read, or are involved actually in some policy discussions, as I was myself in the early 2000s, about UK relations with China, the importance of maintaining good relations with China, which means not pushing human rights too far, for example, is based on an understanding not what the Chinese market is today, but what it will become. Now, that might be entirely a good thing to do. It might be entirely sensible to do that, to make those decisions for the future. But I think it's been very important in shaping the way that people still think about China today. Even though the real importance of the Chinese market has grown, I still think that futurology and thinking about China's future plays a role in empowering China. And it empowers it again by providing, I think, an important immunity and forcing countries to do things that they otherwise wouldn't want to do. I'm pretty sure that a number of governments in the West, if they had the free hand to do so, would push China more on human rights, would actually meet with the Dalai Lama. But because they've seen what happens when you do, and because they're concerned about market access today but also market access tomorrow, then I think that that gives China significant power bestowed on it, empowered from it from without. I think what we're seeing now is a real shift in that as well. That the reality of the Chinese market is much clearer now than it was perhaps in the 1980s or perhaps in 1793 when the McCartney mission first went to China on the same sort of idea. But that is an important dimension of China's global power. Productive power is where I think I have had more of a quandary in thinking about the relationship, as I said before, between states and markets and market actors. Friedrich Engels referred to historical epochs being defined by what is produced, how it's produced, and how the goods are exchanged. I once said that in the Bloomberg building in Hong Kong and was told that I was the first person ever to have mentioned Engels and probably the last in the Bloomberg building in Hong Kong. And I think it's actually an interesting way of thinking about power of production as well. What is produced, how the goods are exchanged. And the how it's produced bit, I think, clearly has been a source of Chinese power. It might be an odd source of Chinese power, particularly if we think back historically. A source of Chinese power was to offer lower production than was previously the case in other places. But it has changed the way things have been produced. And as Francois said this morning, it's also now radically changing the costing and the pricing of goods. And this is a form of global power. It might seem a little bit of an odd power, but it is a form of global power. But I think the key to China's growing material strength, and indeed the growing appeal of China, is its financial power. And here perhaps we need to subdivide it into three elements. Foreign currency holdings, which a lot of, 2 minutes, oh my God, which a lot of people have spoken about as being a potential power, but one I don't think that China can use. The renminbi is something, internationalization of the renminbi is not something that I've dealt with really in this paper, and perhaps I should. But crucially, outward investment. And it's the significance of Chinese outward investment, I think, combined with the impact of the global crisis, which has done so much to increase the appeal of China, particularly in other developing countries, Africa and Latin America. John Williamson, the man who developed the idea of the Washington Consensus, says that it's actually lost power now to the Beijing Consensus. And I think statist developmentalism has clearly come back into the vogue in a number of areas, partly because of what China has done. Not doing things the Western way is important, and I think a lot of it is simply about not being the West. But I would say it's the reality of China as a financial partner that makes it more attractive than conceptions of Chinese culture and conceptions of Chinese history. I think, to put it bluntly, the attraction of somebody or a country is perhaps increased if they've got a great big checkbook in their hand and a pen ready to sign it. So China changes the world. I actually think it's quite difficult to identify what the world would look like if China changed it. Yes, China's dissatisfied with the existing global order. Yes, China wants more votes in the IMF and places like that. Yes, China wants to protect sovereignty and independence and the fact that each should take their own developmental path. But it's not clear that there's a radical alternative being proposed here. And your point about them being reinforcing the status quo, I think is important. China's rise seems to me to be one that will be conditioned by remaining in a global order where the US is the dominant power. I think there is a reluctance to take global leadership as well, and some of the costs and responsibilities of being a global power within China that might entail. I also think we're probably moving into a non-polar world order. The days when you had blocks that came together and stuck together, and if you're in that camp, you're repelled by that camp, I think are gone. I think we're in a fragmented world order. And I think if we're serious about doing an audit, if you like, of Chinese power, we have to think about which dimensions we're talking about. Because I think alliances are fluid. I think countries are going to come together over some issues and fall apart when it comes to others. My bet would be if you said to the BRICS, design a new global order, they would then finish. So I have to finish. What is my conclusion? I once called China a dissatisfied, responsible great power in a paper. I think I'll stick with that. I think I'm going to call it a reformist veto great power as well. But I think crucially, what China's growing global power has done has given it the immunity to defend its own core interests and focus on its regional and local ambitions, national as well. Just finally though, having focused on the global, I want to come back simply to the region at the end, because I think it's in this region, the way that China exercises its regional power is going to have quite a big impact on the way that people outside the region think about how China is going to exercise its global power in the future. I think the easy days for China, where simply not being the West has been enough in a number of developing countries to gain considerable attraction, are probably over. It's easy not to be something. It's when you're identified as what you are that I think people begin to change their policies. Okay, sorry, that was a bit over.
David, you will use the PPT, right?
Yeah, I'm about halfway through, but you guys can...
Yes.
Okay.
Is that on? Okay. So again, I'm sorry for kicking everyone out. The first thing I'd like to say is thanks to Jeho for inviting me and everybody else for sticking through. This is really, I actually anticipated more of a workshop, and this paper is in the middle of being written. So I'm going to look forward to the comments, and then also particularly what Jeho, where he wants me to take it, because I'm interested in sort of different, and I could write the standard paper about, my focus is on Chinese power in Northeast Asia. Evelyn will do sort of Southeast Asia. You know, and the standard story is pretty straightforward, which is that China is way more powerful today than it was 30 years ago. It's much bigger, it's much richer. I'll talk about some of that. It doesn't really, as I think has become clear, have a lot of, it has a lot of material power and influence now, but its ability to do things, whether you call it ideational or normative or soft power, what China stands for, its ability to influence people, its ability to be a leader, its ability to have authority, is severely limited. And you can see that, for example, even in terms of its material power, the limits of its power and its ability to get North Korea to do what it wants it to do. Just this week, North Korea is thumbing its nose at China because Xi Jinping said, you guys shouldn't have nuclear weapons. So it has a lot more power than it used to. People take it a lot more seriously, and yet there are severe limits, particularly on the ideational side. So I could write that paper, and if Jeho wants me to do it, I'm happy to do it. But I got very interested in a fourth thing. So seriously, right, because you can see from the paper, it went around in different ways. But I got very interested in looking at some, because we wanted a real measure of power. And so I've gone down a different path, and if we can start, how do I, here we go, okay. I looked at military expenditures, and I'm really glad Andrew's here, because I love everything he writes. But there's a puzzle here that I find really fascinating, because China's power has increased dramatically, and you don't see a lot of response, even on the material side. So here what we have is military expenditures as a percent of gross domestic product. A lot of security studies scholars call this the defense burden, or the militarization of a country. What proportion of their economy do they devote, does a society choose to devote to its military? And what you can see here, so I have the red is Latin America, 10 countries. You can't really read it there. And then this is slightly different from the paper. And the blue is China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, Philippines, Singapore, and the MIT countries in Australia. In over 25 years. Now in 1988, at the end of the Cold War, not surprisingly, East Asian countries devoted a lot more than Latin American countries to their militaries. It makes a lot of sense. East Asia was a lot more dangerous than Latin America. But what is really surprising is that over 25 years, those numbers have basically converged. And this is counter to, and maybe I'm aimed more at an American audience here, this is counter to the idea that as China has risen, other countries have gotten worried. We expect the line to be going up. But this actually reflects domestic politics, because every year, governments, budgets, ministries, everybody competes for a slice of the pie. So the proportion that a country chooses to spend on its military reflects debates and battles within a budgetary process, the domestic politics. And what this shows is that not just once in a while, but fairly consistently over 25 years, in East Asia, the militaries have lost that battle year after year after year. Their portion of the pie is getting smaller, consistently smaller. Now, I posit to you that is a real puzzle. That is very interesting. But people may say, well, there's other ways to measure it. All the economies are getting bigger. They're all getting richer. So here is absolute spending in inflation-adjusted dollars, constant 2011 dollars. You don't need to be too good at quantitative methods to realize that there's one outlier. It's this, no, right? Obviously, like, this is China, and there's no response over 25 years from the other countries. Here's Japan. This is South Korea. This is everybody else. There's no response to this increase in Chinese spending. So again, Chinese military power, and now, actually, if you were to talk about China, you would say, obviously, they have a lot. They are getting clearly much richer. They have 13 countries and 22,000 kilometers and blah, blah, blah. So we would expect as they get richer, they're going to try and modernize their military. It's not all just offensive, dangerous capability. But it is really remarkable that all the major countries in East Asia have basically no response. Now I'm going to show you a couple more slides, because maybe 25 years is too long to look. That compresses changes. So maybe we're more interested in the last 10 years. Right? Who knows, maybe the 80s, 90s, you can't really tell. But really in the last 10 years, China has pulled off the mask, and the just wait argument that Sean talked about, right? Maybe they haven't done enough now, but they will, you know, in the future. So I'm going to let you look at this for a minute, because I know I'm throwing a lot of data at you, but I think this is so interesting. So this is military absolute spending adjusted for inflation, and I looked at the average annual change. So the annual increase, the average increase over the last 10 years. China, of course, double digit. Japan minus 0.2, blah, blah, blah. The East Asian average is 4.7% average increases in absolute spending. If you take out China, it's 4%. Okay. This is the absolute change over 25 years. So compared to 1988, in 2012, China spent 759% what it had. The average is about double, excluding China. Taiwan is actually minus. In absolute spending, Taiwan spends less today than it did in 1988, adjusted for inflation. But this is hard to read by yourselves. Is 4% big or small? So again, I compared it to Latin America. Average annual change over 10 years and change over 2012. What you notice here is Latin American average is 6% increases over the last decade, average. And 145% total. So if we put those together, what we have is the East Asian average, excluding China, is actually 2/3 of the Latin American average increase over the last 10 years. And over the last 25 years, the average East Asian average, excluding China, is less than the Latin American average increase. And even if you include China, it's really not that different. It's not like orders of magnitude different. They're still fairly similar. So this is a little off the subject, but I think it gets to this question of what is Chinese power and what does it manage to do? Because it is clearly bigger and richer and more powerful than it was 25 or 30 years ago. But almost any way that I measure the data in a comparative context between Latin America and East Asia, you get at least East Asian defense spending looks more like Latin America, and actually, in some ways, Latin Americans are spending more or having greater increases than East Asian countries, despite the fact that China's right next door. And I find that really fascinating. Because this gets to the questions of explaining, so they're a lot more powerful, so they're a lot richer. And we certainly have a media narrative about impending war between China and Japan and South China Sea and everything else. So you would think that the clear impact of Chinese power, you know, if you just read if you don't look at what they're doing, and you just look at what people are saying, it's getting worse, Chinese power is causing everyone to be afraid. But if you look at what they're doing, you don't see a real reaction to the increase in Chinese power that much. So you know, and so partly this gets to this question of what is power, how does it get other countries to do things? Sometimes it's negative. Increases in defense spending cause you to respond. And I think this is a very interesting puzzle. The obvious answer is just wait, 10 years from now. But I think this leads to a lot of interesting questions about what is China and what is Chinese power. And my sense would be, right now, that I think Korea in many ways is a fascinating test case for this. I think China has very little normative or ideational influence over Korea. I mean, it's not like Koreans look to China for solutions or leadership or civilization. Oh, hey, look at the way they're doing it. But as you can see in the paper, in many ways now, there's many Koreans studying in China as there are in the United States. There's clearly a desire now to understand what's happening in China and to interact with it. And if you watch the way that successive Korean presidents have acted, they have tried very carefully to have good relations with China, and they sort of underreact when China does something that's not quite clear what they're doing, ADIZ or whatever else. And in contrast, I would say that the United States probably instinctively might overreact or certainly sees negative intentions for things that aren't ambiguous about Chinese actions. So I think Korea in many ways is a very interesting test case because they really are trying to have good relations with all the different countries, and that the increase in Chinese power has not been accompanied by a similar rise in fears or reaction. I think Taiwan is also an interesting example, right? Like there were the recent kerfuffles with the students, but in general, Taiwan has chosen to open economic relations with China, has reduced its military spending, and I think we, you know, in the discussion, in the Q&A, in the paper, I can certainly speculate onto why is it that countries do that. Even Japan, frankly, the Abe remilitarization is 5% total over 5 years, which, depending on how economic growth goes, that won't even break the 1% of GDP. I mean, it may, but it clearly may not. I mean, this is not a double-digit increases over, you know, year after year. So it strikes me that actually, interesting enough, and I'll conclude by saying this, I don't think countries love China, but I also don't think they plan to go to war with China. It may happen, but I don't think that's the planning right now. So countries are choosing to deal of the array of instruments that countries have at their disposal to deal with increased Chinese power and influence. They're using a number of other things: rhetoric, institutions, pressure, et cetera, et cetera. But what doesn't appear to be happening is a direct, and this would build off of what Sean was just talking about. I don't see blocks emerging in response to clear increases in Chinese power. And so I'll conclude with what everybody knows again. That's why this paper could be easy to write, but I was trying to be a little more interesting. This is Korean trade with China since 1990, whoosh, directly at the expense of the US and Japan. I mean, and in the paper I did Taiwan and Japan. They're all basically identical, almost straight lines upward. You know, everyone is getting more integrated with China. They're not necessarily sure they believe everything or trust everything about China, but the reaction has not also been one of complete fear and containment. So thank you very much. I'll look forward to hearing what you guys have to say and guidance about the future of the paper.
Thank you, Jeho, for the invitation, and it's always a pleasure to be in Seoul, and it's a particular pleasure to be on this panel because I've been involved in a project that relates to some degree to the themes that we've been talking about today. My interest has more been to make a distinction between Chinese power and Chinese influence. So a lot of what we've discussed, particularly in the first half of today's proceedings, have really been about sort of trying to unpack and bring everybody to the same sort of place and understanding, you know, Chinese power resources, right, capabilities, as Jimin pointed out this morning. And I suppose in my paper, although it is a paper about China's power and influence in Southeast Asia, I am quite consciously addressing both power and influence as well. So my understanding is power as resources, just to avoid confusions, as Sean has already pointed out, and influence as actual influence over choices that others make or outcomes to ensure that these outcomes are favorable to China. So the paper's a rather lengthy one, and I do apologize for that. It will be cut. And in many ways, it is the kind of conventional analysis that David was trying to get away from in his on Northeast Asia. And the reason I did that is because Southeast Asia is a bit of an anomaly. Frankly, you know, on the scale of things in East Asia, Southeast Asia is not that important. Never has been, isn't on the Chinese agenda, and isn't particularly on the US or anyone else's agenda. So in some ways, you know, the story of China and Southeast Asia is a little bit different and is a bit of an outlier. Of course, things are a bit more interesting today, but if we are looking, as we're looking, at the last 20 years and looking forward into the next 10, the picture is fairly less exciting than, say, US-China relations or China's power in Northeast Asia. So the paper does the conventional thing of going through the economic realm, the political realm, and the strategic military realm. I'm not going to do all that in the short 15 minutes that I have. I'd just like to highlight, though, what I think is an important sort of context-setting bit of the discussion in the paper. I spent a bit of time at the start of the paper really trying to sort of set out Chinese strategic aims in Southeast Asia and trying to characterize what is it about the particular kinds of shared strategic goals in Southeast Asia that has defined and characterized their approach to China. I think it's quite important to understand strategic goals if we have the intention to analyze influence as opposed to simply power. If you don't know what the goals of the influence wielder is, it's really hard to judge whether influence is achieved because you don't know if the goals are achieved. China's power has always loomed large over Southeast Asia, and there's a long history of this. But over the last 20 years, what's been striking is that Southeast Asian states have been at the forefront of not resisting, but managing China's rise and China's increasing power. So there is a bit of a 20-year track record there to look at. It's quite a rich record. What it suggests, just briefly, where I get to in the paper, is that while China's material power advantage very clearly cannot be doubted, its ability to translate these resources into actual influence over even Southeast Asian choices and policies is much less clear. So the implication here being that even if China's not able to translate resources into influence, even over these very small, relatively less strategically important states, we've got to be asking, what is it actually doing with its resources? So China's strategic aims in Southeast Asia, I think this is quite an important question to ask, because arguably, it's got no good reason to pay this collection of relatively small states so much attention in terms of the devotion of diplomatic, political resources, economic resources that it's put into this region in the last 20 years. In many ways, as part of the 走出去 policy, the going out policy, Southeast Asia was the sort of first frontier that China pushed at. And I argue in the paper that China's got two key strategic aims in the region. One's very general, which is what it does to the rest of the world. It's about, protecting or ensuring that there are no conflicts that arise that would compromise Chinese sovereignty, territorial integrity, national security. It's particularly important in a near abroad like Southeast Asia. In this regard, of course, the South China Sea territorial disputes has kind of waxed and waned and waxed again as, you know, one of these key elements of tension. I'll talk a bit about that if I have time. The other key strategic imperative China has towards Southeast Asia is, again, a sort of slightly more generic one regarding its periphery. It's to pacify, to secure its periphery, so as to avoid being encircled by another great power. Now, this is not, I think it's wrong to think about this in sort of counterbalancing terms, in containment terms, counter-containment terms. I simply, you know, from my reading of sort of Chinese sources and so on and so forth, that's simply not the way it's thought about. It's more complex. You know, it's kind of about, the Chinese call it 塑造周边, you know, shaping neighboring areas through, you know, various kinds of political, economic activities to avoid isolation, to forestall containment, and to prevent counterbalancing alliances. And this is particularly in the context of an international order that I think, you know, China has shown pretty clearly over the last 20 years that it understands is a pretty hierarchical kind of order. There is one superpower and possibly a number of great powers, 一超多强, but essentially there is a superpower layer on there. So pretty much, you know, pacifying the periphery is about preventing the US particularly from being able to recruit other states from, you know, a balancing coalition against China. And Dave has written about this before in 2002, quite controversially, arguing that, you know, there are lots of states in East Asia who, because of, quite convincingly, that East Asian states innately, because of their historical experiences, would not be open to this kind of activity. But if you look at the Chinese record in Southeast Asia, China's not taken this for granted and has, you know, deployed a range of, you know, economic, political, institutional elements, particularly to persuade Southeast Asian states not to make that kind of a choice. So it's about reshaping the incentive structure and perceptions of these neighbors so that they would not agree to become complicit in an attempt by the US particularly to constrain China. There's a bit of a subtle difference here, right? It's not sort of an automatic thing, it's not structurally imposed, there is a degree of persuasiveness to it, there's a great deal of agency accorded to even pretty small states. So it's a particular thing about the Chinese approach to Southeast Asia. Southeast Asian states, of course, you know, it's a very diverse region. I was saying to Francois this morning that it's kind of like talking about European Union's approach to China. You know, it's a bit difficult to draw a common line, but there are some shared strategic imperatives amongst the 10 Southeast Asian states that broadly shape the parameters of how they approach China. The very key thing, of course, there's a lot of duality in this. On the one hand, you know, the huge webs and of interdependence and depths of interconnectedness that these polities and economies increasingly have with China is undeniable. So that, you know, vastly increasing interdependence at the same time has been accompanied by, you know, fears and anxieties about China's threat to regional security that have never really gone away. Again, it's, you know, these fears have waxed and waned and waxed again in the last 20 years, but they've never gone away. And at the heart of that duality is this sort of, you know, the kind of anxieties that are felt by small states, you know, that gained independence after the Second World War, you know, and had lots of sort of intramural difficulties. So two key aims in foreign policies for Southeast Asian states is, one key aim is strategic diversification, right? The absolute priority on preventing potential dominance by one key power, whether internal or external, is a very sort of marked characteristic that we can trace throughout this whole period and has very important implications for the extent and the degree and the limits to which Southeast Asia is prepared to accommodate China and what else it tends to do at the same time as it's apparently accommodating China. This is particular relevance for US power and influence in this part of the world. So, you know, when you look at how Southeast Asian states have responded to Chinese power, you know, it's always through the matrix of trying to balance between, or to manage the twin uncertainties of Chinese intentions, but also the uncertainties of US regional commitments, right, and the engagement of other major powers. So it's a bigger sort of context there. Now, like I said, the rest of the paper, goes through the political and institutional realm, the economic realm, and then the military and strategic realm. And just some headlines from each of these sections without boring you too much. On the political and institutional front, I mean, Dave has already alluded to the sort of richness of approaches that East Asian states as a whole have taken to China. And when you try and think about Chinese power, a lot of it seems to be mediated through regional institutions, particularly. And of course, the party most guilty for proliferating these institutions is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And so when you look at the sort of China-Southeast Asian relationships, it's very difficult to get away from these institutions. I guess the, sort of really important thing to note about these is that it is true that by the first half of the 2000s, so in the period between about 1995 and 2005, China used Southeast Asia and these regional institutions as a premier demonstration precinct, really, to sort of push its alternative image of China as an opportunity, China is not a threat, right? Trying to demonstrate its sensitivity to the comfort of smaller players, buying into the ASEAN way, letting ASEAN retain the driver's seat, so on and so forth, signing up to various kinds of soft norms that the Southeast Asian states particularly promote. And that was kind of the heyday of this stuff, and a lot of the soft power, normative power stuff that, if you want to analyze, would reside in those realms. But my argument is that China's influence over the nature, the membership, and the scope of these institutions has been very, very mixed. China's not been able to dominate these regional institutions by a long way. Southeast Asian states have, tried to embed China within wider types of enmeshment of other great powers. So China's not been able to, by itself, lead in any of these institutions. And critically, Southeast Asian enmeshment of China does hinge upon US security dominance in the region. And this has subsequently as well facilitated US influence continually upon the agendas of key institutions, as well as US promotion of alternative regional institutions in the region. And that's been a sort of consistent trend. I've just been told that I have 2 minutes, so I'm going to give you the highlights from the economic realm and the strategic realm really quickly. On the economic front, it's to echo a lot of what Sean has already said, but also, my paper, I think, develops quite a bit on that theme about strategic diversification, particularly in the economic realm as well. China's not been able to, in spite of its growing share of trade, particularly with Southeast Asian countries, has not been able to sort of turn that uncontroversially or easily into influence over outcomes of what these states have chosen. What is very clear, though, is that many Southeast Asian states calculate for longer-term benefits. So a lot of this betting on the future has led to key Southeast Asian states making short-term, very costly choices in the economic realm. Free trade agreements with China, for instance, with the result of certain industries and agricultural sectors being massively outcompeted, for example. But that's about, calculating on the long-term benefits. And the other thing that comes out of the economic realm is China's dual policy towards the more developed parts of Southeast Asia and the less developed parts of Southeast Asia, mainland Southeast Asia, with complementary but different kinds of economic tools, again, to engage and to persuade and to transform, really, the Southeast Asian infrastructural landscape particularly. Again, though, that hasn't led to simple sort of rolling over into a Chinese sphere of influence. Even Laos, which is arguably in many ways the weakest of the Southeast Asian countries, has leveraged upon Chinese interest and economic interest in Laos to use that as a bargaining chip to go to international financial institutions and other donor states to negotiate for better terms for loans and so on and so forth for infrastructural and other types of projects. And of course Myanmar, exactly to avoid the kind of overdependence on China, has partly for that reason, engaged in reforms. On the strategic realm, there's huge amounts of interest in South China Sea. We can discuss this if you like, in the question and answer session. And if we take the 20-year time period, it's only really important to understand that there's been 2 periods of serious tensions between Southeast Asia and China on the South China Sea. The early part of the mid part of the 1990s, after China's forceful takeover, occupation of the Mischief Reef, which were claimed within an area claimed by the Philippines, and then more recently, since about 2009, with the resurgence of Chinese assertiveness in this part of the world. And in between, though, right, and there's a whole decade in between, it was a period of greater optimism when, both Southeast Asians and China tried to at least present the narrative that negotiation could be a way forward in this. I'd only conclude this by saying that, well, on the sort of military side of the spectrum now, it was really interesting. I was looking at some sort of promotional material ahead of the the Asia Pacific or the Asian Air Show in Singapore a few months ago, where the defense industry basically tries to sell kit. And it's really interesting how Southeast Asia, of anywhere in East Asia, is being promoted as the next big market, right? And there's all these sort of figures out there about, some of which I quote, which are in contradiction to what Dave has tried to present. The sort of significant increases in military expenditures across key Southeast Asian states, because not interested in all of them, but the maritime ones particularly, and with the types of acquisition profiles that suggest, defensiveness, against perceived increasing threats from China in the maritime realms. And of course, they're all starting from very, very low bases. That's part of the problem. But it's interesting that, defense suppliers are really sort of pushing Southeast Asia as the next big market. So there is no doubt that the security dilemma, and I say this in the paper, security dilemma in the South China Sea, is at a pitch that it hasn't been at for the last 20 years. This is the most sort of tense bit of the spiral that we've seen since the end of the Cold War, and I can't be optimistic on that side of on that part of the equation, but in general, though, the Southeast Asian side of the picture is not that simple. Even in the strategic military realm, we still find key Southeast Asian states trying to have their cake and eat it too, trying to harness US power, get the US more involved in the South China Sea at the expense of emboldening some actors and antagonizing others, but also trying still to keep the kind of defense engagement and diplomacy and pacifying of China at the same time. I give some examples of Vietnam and Indonesia in the paper. So, anyone looking for simple narratives in Southeast Asia would be disappointed, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 2 discussants. Professor Goldman will discuss Professor Breslin and Professor Goh's papers, and then Professor Kennedy will comment on Professor Breslin and Professor Kang's papers. Okay? So 15 minutes each.
Thanks a lot. I am in front of 2 very different papers, both of them extremely interesting, but one of them is factual, very careful about its facts, partly historical. That's Evelyn Goh's paper on how Southeast Asia has reacted to the interaction with China. And the other one is a highly discursive, hypothetical paper based on a lot of work and a lot of references to theories which shown successfully applies, but it's clearly not located on a particular region, it's completely global, so I really have to separate the 2. I will start by Evelyn's paper, saying first of all that I agree with 100% of the facts that are there, which is already something, and I think that she has gone a long way to show by example the complexity of the relationship with China, that she has shown some of the dilemma that we could point out also for Northeast Asia, which I sometimes call the regional schizophrenia of having increasing economic ties while having reservations and hedging on the security front and having to live with the two. I notice that this is not called a hesitation between engagement and containment. This is not something that clearly separates politics and economics. It is something that is slightly more confused. And if I was to ask a first question of her, it would be, wouldn't you say, on balance, within your paper, and shouldn't you at some point emphasize that if there are givers and takers, or pushers and takers in this world, China is more of a pusher and ASEAN is more of a taker, because the chronological changes, which she very carefully and painstakingly describes, happen to be originated by China rather than by ASEAN. One gets the feeling throughout the paper that ASEAN is suffused by an overall benign attitude towards China, which it's quite untiringly tries to implement, stops when it has to stop, then tries again without much changes. I noticed that even enlargement of ASEAN, for example, doesn't really figure as a major change, which shows probably that there was a balance within ASEAN that existed before and that exists after enlargement. But on the whole, it does seem China which is experimenting with its own environment. And I think if that's really the case, it is, of course, something important. I think we guess from what Evelyn writes, but we could see at times a little more clearly. There are countries which she mentions as potential stooges in two instances, and she particularly singles out Laos and or is it Cambodia? Sorry, Cambodia and the 2012 ASEAN summit, and documents the Chinese pressure on Cambodia. But it would be interesting to see, after all, while the third Indochina war was going on, ASEAN was deeply split throughout the attempts to achieve a peace process. It was deeply split because its members were informally taking sides. And that, of course, diminished the organization's overall ability. Is there something like that? Or has China brought, perhaps unwittingly and unwillingly, ASEAN together in the last period, apart from, a few outliers who can be leaned on? I think that is important. I think a third question, unfortunately, many of my questions, and perhaps because I'm a European, and of course I instinctively make the rapprochement between ASEAN regional construction and its varying degrees of success, and European regional construction and success. I'm not even mentioning Ukraine and Crimea and Russia, by the way, which are very interesting last-minute test case for European cohesion and for Western cohesion. But even not getting into that, I think a lot of questions are, what was ASEAN made for? Michael Leifer, I think it's 15 years ago, wrote something calling the ASEAN peace process a category mistake, and explained that ASEAN had in fact very limited goals, and the goals were essentially to avoid conflict rather than to solve the conflicts. Has this changed? Is there something regional? You do mention the hesitations or the doubts about US coming to the defense of ASEAN in some cases. That could turn into a critique of David Kong's paper, but I'm going to refrain from it because somebody else is going to take care of that. But relying on the US and then not seeing the US coming in may be a familiar problem for maritime issues in the future. I have difficulty believing that the US will rise to the level of a military conflict over, what's the phrase, uninhabited and inhabitable rocks, as somebody very close to the White House put it, if it hasn't risen to even credible sanctions on Crimea and Ukraine. That's the only allusion I will make, but there I know that I'm going beyond commenting on Evelyn's paper. I think through this, there is the question of whether China takes ASEAN seriously, which is a question, of course, we Europeans ask ourselves every day about the EU, and the answer is not wholly convincing, of course, although recently it has become a little more convincing. Is ASEAN just a one-way stop to what I would call a return to a tributary system sort of mutualized by ASEAN? Or is China genuinely playing, and you seem to imply it when you talk about, you have a part about mega FTAs and multilateral trade diplomacy, where I think you should probably point out, unless you don't believe in it, of course, which is also a possibility, but I tend to believe that ASEAN countries have a unique, ASEAN economies have a unique opportunity there to shape together some of their engagement with the various forces which are sort of courting them over these treaties, and certainly between RCEP and TPP. But do you believe in that, or do you think it's going to be ad hoc, in fact, and that there is no leverage? I think that's important. Sean's paper is absolutely brilliant because he has the power to detach himself precisely from the immediate picture and to look beyond. And I think, you know, since Jim Mann's book about our fantasies on China, we know that the China we engage is partly a China we fabricate. It's been like that since the 18th century. So I think his idea of China's imagined power, the shadow that China cast over its own future with neighbor, the shadow, or on the contrary, the sunlight, if one is positive about it, is something very important to remember. I think it is absolutely an important component of China's foreign relations. I have one or two strong questions to ask him, which I think should at least be answered theoretically when he revises the paper, if not with facts, because I admit that there's a big virtue to having a paper which simply states the various options and theories, and nobody is going to prove or disprove within 25 pages the result. And the first of these questions is whether China projects the image of its future because it is luring people with its market, its success, and its capacity to integrate and to dissolve its own identity, its own strategic identity. Somehow, you know, we keep talking about fragmented authoritarianism, market and state, Neo-Confucianism, and the individual, the Taoist instinct in Chinese culture. And it all hangs together. It's the beauty of a system that has avoided chaos while giving more and more room for individual, local, market. Is that what is luring us? When I say us, I really mean all of us globally. Or is it the fact that China is the last realist, sovereignist power, tenacious, sometimes able to keep grudges for a very long time? I was recently in D.C., in Washington, D.C., talking to somebody who is influential on the foreign policy process, and when we described the approach that others should have with China in terms of foreign policy, his comment was, so just make sure you stay with a group. Don't get isolated outside from the group, which I thought was you know, I don't know, probably that person may have thought, but I'm not even sure that the US was the good shepherd intended to guard the flock. But leaving that question out, there is also a question of projection of force in China's policies. And even within trade and economics, that's where I think there is a disconnect with the traditional view of soft power. China indeed has very little soft power, and the soft power that it has is totally societal and individual. Culture, tiger education, if I may, and the virtues of traditional society, which are not unique to China, by the way, doesn't translate into political influence, but trade, economy is part of hard power. This is something they are able to exercise, as we all were we were there before the war, even among Europeans, and everybody has been there in terms of the developing world post-World War. But they are there, and that is an important concern. These are two very rich papers. I just add in a half sentence that David Kang's paper is, I'm not supposed to comment on it, but I will still say it's a wonderful corrective to newspaper headlines about imminent conflict, which are always appearing. And I always like to remind Asians that, you know, within 3 hours of the heartland of Europe, we have Syria and a massacre. We have the sub-Saharan insecurity belt. We have all the hesitation about the post-Soviet world. Yet, I don't believe your thesis either, but it's for a side hall discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Scott, all yours.
Perfect. Thanks for this opportunity to read these papers, and listening to Evelyn's presentation now as well is given it a new perspective. And I think these three papers go together really well and fit with the entire volume. Before I offer comments about the two papers on, individually, I just, in listening to the presentations, reading the papers, and throughout the day, it's clear to me that all of the authors are trying to individually define power, capabilities, influence. We're all doing that. Sometimes we're using the same types of terms and same concepts, and sometimes we're not. And so there's a potential for apples and oranges. And I think rather than us carrying that water and taking that space, that would be the opportunity for the editor to do that and to share that with us, so that when we revise, we are not talking past each other. Because I think some of the differences in, for example, David and Evelyn's papers are partly about measurements and definitions as opposed to actually disagreements about anything real. And I think that's really, that'll make the volume stronger and hold together more than anything if we've got that sort of common language. And we don't have to agree with each other. I could still say, I don't think your definition for power and capabilities and influence is the right one, but at least we have a starting point that the readers and all of us would begin with. So I think that's coming through loud and clear that would be helpful. All right, let me say something about the two papers. In reading Sean's paper, I immediately thought of Gerald Siegel's Does China Matter? But I also thought of Sean's own 1996 paper in Third World Quarterly on Chinese on foreign investment in China.
Somebody read that paper.
Yes. And so did my students. And so that paper said that Chinese local officials took anything that came their way for investment. It wasn't top-down state developmental policies that determined which ways foreign investment went into China. It was, we will take whatever we can because we are competing with all these other local governments. It seems that times have changed. That Chinese ability to direct economic investment in things it's not the way it used to be. So you could refer to yourself and all of those changes. Don't be bashful, because we know you never are. So just let it out. I think I agree with as was just said, it's a stylized paper, a think piece with some information, but what you're trying to do is lay out a broad conception, and I think that's totally fine. And I think in general agree. It's in this type of paper, it's a little bit difficult to say, well, you must use this evidence to prove it and stuff, because really that's not your purpose. Is to lay out a conception of what the possibilities are, as opposed to for sure. And that makes it a little bit different than the other papers, but that's still okay. And I would agree that in terms of market power and that imagined power, or the shadow of the future, is where China sticks out the most. Its reputation precedes itself. And its influence is via its existence, like gravity. And there's folks who have written about the gravity model of power. And I think that more than anything explains the attention that China is getting, like this magnet. At the same time, I'm still less convinced, and this comes from my own presentation and my work on global governance, that China is an alternative ideal and safe harbor for rogue regimes and alternative conceptions of world order. I do agree to some extent they're pushing for live and let live, away from sort of allowing all different, 100 flowers to bloom, right? And away from forcing harmonization, or at least making it mandatory. And in particular with regard to the role of the state in the economy. But I don't know if it's much more than that. That is something, but it's very different than what the Cold War was about, and the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. There's big fights, but that fight is between this place and this place on the spectrum, instead of out here. It's a much narrower type of conflict. And in fact, if you look at how the United States and Europe actually developed over the last few hundred years, we did many of the things the Chinese are doing now. We just don't admit it, and some say pull away the ladder, that type of thing. So I think there's less of a normative fight than we argue, because it's in USTR's interest to say that what the Chinese are doing are things that we wouldn't possibly do. In terms of in terms of Chinese advocacy, they are not carrying the water for the South anymore. If they ever did, they don't look like India. And I know that was asking for the comparison with the U.S., but India is a much different player at the global level in terms of its advocacy than China has been. And as you write, China has been relatively reticent in coming up with clear alternative visions of what the world might look at and what norms and principles might underpin it on page 18. I think it would be useful to explore more why that's the case. There's a variety of possibilities. It might just be that they're holding their cards until they can jump out and go, ha ha, right? Well, I don't think that it might be that they actually are beneficiaries of the current system, and that's possibly true. It may also be because U.S. power hasn't declined as much as many say, and they're still there, and that's affecting what's going on in Southeast Asia, for example. Just say Burma, and you've got a good example there. And I think the other one that appears in your paper is about socialization. That enmeshment has worked. It may not be the enmeshment that we originally thought it was going to be, but it has been quite extensive. Chinese have learned both liberal norms and illiberal norms and tools all at the same time, and they look and behave more like just like every other large power that thinks it can push its weight around. So I'd be curious if you would engage the socialization question, which seems to me particularly important. Let's see, in terms of David's paper, I think that this is a great piece of medicine in reaction to everything that one hears in Washington. And the data point, the contrast with Latin America is brilliant. And I would
stop.
No, yeah.
Thank you.
Right. Yeah. So that's it. And I would So, but anything else I'm going to say is actually is not as important as that. And I think you could actually go further with the comparison, because as we've heard, the macro data on spending as a percentage of GNP is probably not enough. It definitely raises a puzzle that's worth exploring. But I would spend some more time in Latin America and talking about, even though it's a paper about China and Southeast Asia, Brazil and the others are also responding to China in interesting ways. That is useful to ponder. So I would think about that. I wouldn't use it just as a way to get people to think. I actually think that at the beginning, I think there's actually more substance in that comparison that you could use to further your broader point. I guess the area where I think there's not as much discussion in it that there could be is on what actually folks in East Asia think about China. because there is this puzzle. Well, they are not ramping up spending, so your default is that they're not anxious about it. But is that really what they think? And you know, one of the things of a rising power is that if it's going to be generating potential opponents, it may not be visible in their explicit military expenditures, but it may be in many other ways. And I think that type of information, whether it's surveys or statements by officials, defense officials, what happens at ARF or these other meetings, would be a way to fill in those type of blanks, because it is in some way surprising that that there is that gap between China's rise, their lack of macro response in terms of spending, but it does seem that they're not just sitting on their hands entirely. That there must be more there. That would be. I think that there's more to that concern, and they are essentially. My guess is that it's a hedging story, but how do you see that in terms of just sort of one type of quantitative measure in between the spending as a percentage of GNP and absolute dollars? There's spending as a proportion of your government budget. I think actually that might be more that provide more information as percentage of GNP, just because the economies have been growing so quickly, military spending could not help but fall. And I'm sure education spending has fallen as a percentage of GNP, healthcare spending has fallen as a percentage of GNP, everything has fallen as a percentage of GNP, because nothing can keep up with 8 to 10% growth of GNP unless you're China. So I would go to their budgets and use that. So, but I think the argument's quite interesting. The papers speak well to each other, and I think it's exciting part of the book.
Thank you very much. Let me throw in some of my own comments. First, about power. When I was planning this book, I thought about it. But then again, I have to bring in Laswell, Dahl, Organsky, and Nye, and all that. Then still, will the contributors accept my own operational definition in their writing? My answer was no. You will still come up with your own in your chapter. So I decided to leave it up to each contributor to define their own operational concepts of power, inference, capability that is suitable to each sector that they are dealing with. Let me start with the David's paper. When I first assigned this paper to David, I thought about David's widely cited paper in International Security that came out in 2003. Back then, I thought that was a brilliant discussion of what was sort of overlooked in the field. But then again, I thought after 2010, whether or not Asia remained the same or Asia sort of changing to cope with more assertive China, if not more aggressive. And about the data, I have 3 sort of potential rebuttals to your argument. First of all, the use of aggregate data may shroud some of the outliers. Even excluding China, you have Vietnam, Indonesia, which are investing a lot more on military modernization. And that's sort of shrouded in the use of aggregate data. Second one, I think this is probably applicable to South Korea as well, but smaller countries, which are really small compared to China, these countries always think, even if we invest a lot of money in military modernization, the marginal utility of that extra investment in military modernization is so low compared to what China has. So, they don't really think about matching the capabilities that China has. And third one, the one word that you never said in your presentation is the United States. All these countries in Northeast and South Asia actually passing the buck to the United States, which is a hegemon. They expect the United States to deal with the rise of China to a considerable extent. I think that is manifested in the data that you show. Now, Evelyn's paper, I think we scholars are always agonize over keeping the balance between generalizing and dissecting. And somehow in your paper, Southeast Asia is mostly treated as one sort of entity, rather than dissecting it into, let's say, whether there are some variations between the maritime Southeast Asia or continental Southeast Asia and so on. So although, you know, my basic request was that you deal with Southeast Asia as one entity, but in some segments of the paper, I would like you to sort of bring out differences depending on the issues concerned. Finally, Sean's paper, I just have one question about this phrase, definitional power. I don't know what that really means here. Is there a sort of equivalent in Chinese, or are you referring to that as meaning a sort of discourse power, or 话语权?
Yes.
Okay, then I think definitional power is not really as popularly used as a discourse power. So, but anyway, you can respond later. So this time in reverse order, Evelyn goes first.
Thank you. I guess two main questions which actually are related. I guess I'll come back to Cheo's questions first because it's just come up. Actually, I think, in fact, that the paper doesn't treat Southeast Asia as a whole. I don't know if Francois had the same sort of impression from reading the paper, but that was exactly what I was trying not to do. Perhaps the only section that actually treats Southeast Asia collectively is the section on institutions, for the reason that you know, ASEAN has tended to work through ASEAN, or Southeast Asian states have tended to work through ASEAN for regional institutions. Even there, of course, as we're well aware, there has been lots of divisions. I have to declare myself and say I'm not a believer in ASEAN, so my judgment of ASEAN is very harsh, which is why in the paper I never talk really about ASEAN unless I mean ASEAN. I always talk about Southeast Asian states, and I try to identify particular states where I can. So in the economic section, for instance, I try and sort of pull out particular states. I make a distinction between the more developed states that China has targeted under CAFTA, and I make a distinction between the states that are involved in the Greater Mekong sub-region, continental Southeast Asian states. And certainly, you know, in the strategic realm, we are really talking not about ASEAN at all, and it's not collective at all. We're talking about Vietnam, Indonesia for Miyake, the Philippines, key for different reasons. So I'll go through it again, but I'm not sure that it actually treats Southeast Asia collectively at all.
Certain states
I do.
More explicit.
Yeah, I'll be more explicit about it. And this is also in response to you that part of the reason for doing that is because I don't think there are neat lines that you can draw. It's very tempting. I contributed to this myself 10 years ago when I first started looking at Southeast Asia, to draw the line between continental and maritime Southeast Asia. That no longer works. It's more complex than that. What is really interesting is that, you know, the states that have changed their minds, that they're too small to balance, I have now decided that they've got to try, right? The states that previously were lumped as continental are no longer Vietnam, right? It's a key one. Vietnam used to be lumped with CLMV. No, it's now regarded as a maritime, regards itself as a maritime state with maritime interests to protect. So the lines are very fudged. And I suppose, Francois, that kind of, you know, responds to, in part to your question as well about whether, you know, ASEAN is really a giver or a taker. And you're right, of course, that in many ways China has, apart from the early 1990s when ASEAN had these initiatives, and Southeast Asian states individually reached out to China, for a lot of the last 20 years, China has pushed initiatives and Southeast Asia has had to react. The very key ones being the free trade agreement. And also defense diplomacy as well. China's been very sort of forthcoming on that. And that, of course, really reflects ASEAN limitations and Southeast Asian states' limitations of working together or agreeing on anything, which have only gotten worse. China has not brought ASEAN together. It's exacerbated the divides. I'll stop there.
Thank you. David?
Yeah. No, these are very helpful. I think the government budget is definitely something that would be very interesting to look at, right? I mean, this is, a little background is this is part of a larger project that I've started because I started following the defense spending in 2003 after getting Asia wrong. And everybody said, just wait. So I did. I waited like 10 years, right? And I kept seeing defense spending going like this, and I kept seeing headlines, oh my God, it's going like that. So finally I started, this last year, I really started to focus on it. And I think So the next step, I mean, the most important thing is obviously for this paper, and I'll try and write it so that it can fit into the larger question that you want us to answer. But just so that people understand, so I really waited for 10 years. I said, okay, now I'm going to write. I'm not going to wait till I retire to talk about it. And I think the next step is really to get beyond the macro and look at the micro responses, some of what they're buying, government budgets, and then I think we may or may not get a very different view, but I haven't gone that. I mean, that takes a lot of effort, you know. What I did do, and I can certainly put it into the paper. Evelyn knows this because I was in Australia, right? And I had it on the slide. I didn't put it in there, but I took out, because the big counterfactual in East Asia is this: if the U.S. wasn't there, would everyone be more afraid? Right? I mean, this is the basic argument, the sort of Brooks-Wohlforth deep engagement argument about the importance of the American presence in any region rests on the counterfactual that if the U.S. wasn't there, things would be a lot worse. Some people like Rand Paul say they'd be a lot better, you know, they'd pull back. But I mean, the basic conventional view in the United States is rests on a counterfactual, because we don't know that because we still are here. So what I did try and do is separate out countries with a U.S. military alliance and countries without. And I'll tell you, the lines are basically the same. Ostensibly, countries that can free ride on the U.S. defense commitment should be spending less, and countries without, as Francois pointed out, I don't think anyone thinks the U.S. is coming to the defense of Vietnam if they fight China. So they ostensibly should be spending more, or Malaysia or whatever else. Those lines are actually roughly the same the whole way. When we had when I was in Australia at ANU, big argument about whether the U.S. presence provides public goods. Simply the fact that we're there, right? And so I think there's a lot more specific in which I can get into this, you know. So I will stop there, but I think I have a better idea of how to frame the revision of the paper, so thanks.
Sean?
Thank you all three for the comments. All very useful. And oddly enough, I don't think I disagree with any of them really. The projection, of course, I think that's really important, and not being outside the group, and having watched sort of from the how can I put this? Not too far away from the policy process in the UK to what happened after Cameron met the Dalai Lama, and what's happened to other European leaders who sort of apologised. I think that's really very interesting, the fact that ministerial visits were being cancelled at short notice, and people were actually going to China and then finding that the minister was too busy even to meet with them. Was very interesting. I think the thing that perhaps comes out of combined comments is I need to perhaps make a clearer separation between statements, official statements if you like, the projection and the reception, because they're the three different things, because quite clearly, as far as being an advocate for the South, in the official documents it's very clearly there, but that's not necessarily the same thing as a real action on behalf of, but the reception thing I think is interesting, and it comes back to what you were saying about the difference between, you know, the positions, and I actually, as soon as you said I'm never shy of coming forward, I will mention the paper I hired in International Affairs on the China model a couple of years ago, in which I tried to trace a line between the American system of the 1830s through to the Chinese political economy of today. And the original version had large tracts from Henry Clay in there, which I was forced to take out by the copy editor. But if you want to see a definition of state-led developmental capitalism, read Henry Clay. He was forced to spend 2 days in the House defending the American system, and did so in such an eloquent style. It's really interesting to read. And that, you know, I'm not saying China today is America then, but it's really interesting. But it's the way that China became the metaphor, I think perhaps is the way of putting it, for difference, for alternatives that I was trying to get. Socialisation, yeah, I think that's right. Beneficiary, all those things. Your point about the projection, I think that's important too. So I think, yeah, I just need to take those. Now, I'm not going to use the word evidence, I'm going to use the word data. And when I use the word I here, I mean my PhD student, I have started collecting together comparative data on America and China, but not just America and China, but also in the areas that we're looking at other major players. So in terms of outward investment, for example, the EU is still a massive player, and so is Japan. We've also done things on peacekeeping and things like that. However, maybe that would be better not in this paper at all, because it's not evidence actually, it's data, but actually a data set, appendices at the end of the volume as a whole. Maybe that's what we should be thinking about in terms of that, because it's not evidence, it's how you interpret it in some ways. The final thing, the discursive power, yeah, I mean, it's from a paper I read. It's coming back to this thing I was reading about human security. I had to do this for a research grant that I got. I read, I think, every paper that's been written in Chinese on human security. There's not that many, to be fair. But one of them did say, and I thought it was quite, and they used discursive power. They said, we can't sit back and let the others define the terms of debates. We have to come forward with our own definitions. Even if that's to say, you must judge us against our own definition, and that's the sort of defensive thing I was saying before. But we did, Sonia Skeets and myself did a report for Chatham House last year on China and the international human rights regime, and one of the things that we did find, and it's on a small scale, is that in Geneva, the Chinese delegation now trying to establish their terms and definitions as the starting points for debates. So that's why I thought definitional power might actually work better than discursive, but I'm not massively wedded to it. But I do think it's interesting that it's not a matter of sitting back and saying human security. What's that got to do with this Western bourgeois liberal conception? Everybody believes in human security. We believe that it means this, and this is now how we're going to be operational. Perhaps tangential to this paper, but it is. I think it is something that's different from before. But thank you very much for the comments.
Okay, thank you very much. The first mini session is now adjourned. We'll use just 1 minute to change the nameplates and so on. The panelists for the next mini session, please come up.